Hi, Sarah.
All right. Well, welcome everyone after a little bit of a hiatus to another episode of Comp Title Book Club. I am so pleased to break our dry spell with historical novelist Sarah Holz, who is with us today. It's good to have you on, Sarah.
Hi, everybody. It's good to be here. I'm honestly, I'm just so excited. This is hoping to have a lot of fun this afternoon.
As you know, I love talking craft. For those who are listening and watching, I have known Sarah for five years, maybe.
Almost 5 years now. Yeah.
Yeah, we met originally in an editor-writer relationship, and she's just a fantastic historical talent. I'll go into her bio and the jacket copy of her latest release here in a second, but it's just I'm so excited to talk craft with talented writers. By the way, if this is your first time dropping into Comp Title Book Club, please know that there is a live option. You can register on Zoom to watch a Zoom webinar of these chats. And if you are a live participant, hi, we're so happy to have you.
Mhm.
You might have hopped on because you know Sarah's work. You might have hopped on because you know her comp title, Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall. If you have any burning questions about Wolf Hall, about Sarah's books, about historical writing in general, fiction or non, all of them require research. Feel free to drop that in the chat. I'll be checking it intermittently so that I can weave your questions in with mine. But let's just dive right in with introducing our esteemed guest. So Sarah Holtz was born in Cleveland, Ohio, but grew up in Buffalo, New York, where the long winters gave her plenty of time to read and dabble in writing. She now lives in her adopted hometown, Pittsburgh, with her wife and completely ridiculous cats, all of whom indulge her tastes for obscure trivia and esoteric history. And I hope maybe we get to indulge having a cat pop in at some point today.
It's possible one has fallen asleep on the chair just outside of view, so maybe he'll wake up
Oh,
later.
maybe the beast will arise.
Yeah.
Um, Sarah still reads too much, same, but is trying to learn to balance that out with her rediscovered love of writing. The author of 5 books, her God's Wife series is a historical fantasy reimagining of late Ptolemaic Egypt and early imperial Rome, and her standalone novel, The Flight of Virtue, is an alternative history novel set in revolutionary France during the Summer of Terror, right?
Yeah, right. That's the main focus is right
Yeah,
there at 1794. Had to think
yeah.
about it for a minute.
And don't worry, I won't fact check you. You're the
No,
historian.
it's okay. Yeah, everybody in the comments can start being like, did she do any research?
Actually. And then her newest novel, which just came out yesterday, so happy belated pub day, is
Thank you.
called The Gourd and the Stars, and it is a medieval romance about the fall of the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem. So, yeah, that's a little overview of Sarah's work. And if you might indulge me, I'd like to read your jacket copy for The Gourd and the Stars so people
Oh,
know.
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah,
No,
so I think
absolutely.
it's available right now in Kindle version. Did you go wide, like wide publication with this one?
Yeah, I
Okay.
pretty much, particularly with ebooks, it's pretty much available everywhere. As an indie author, I publish through Draft to Digital, does all my distribution for me. And they actually, this is the first book that I am doing the paperback through them as well, as opposed to like Amazon KDP. So theoretically, you can get the paperback more places than I have had in the past. Usually, I paperback is Amazon exclusive,
Mm,
but this time around, if you want to get it at Barnes and Noble, you can. Um, I don't really know which other of my distributors do hard copies because mostly it's a lot of ebook distribution for,
okay.
Kobo, Hoopla, uh, Scribed, which is now Everand for novels. But pretty much you can look me up anywhere, and you should be able to find at least a version of my books, at least the
Fantastic.
ebook.
Well, I may be biased, but I think you're going to want to check out The Gourd and the Stars. I really enjoyed reading it as I was editing it, and I just think it's just such a gorgeous novel. So here's a little spiel about it, and then we'll get into our questions. So the jacket copy is, quote, "Thou wert born not a demon, but a light so bright that the darkness cannot touch thee," end quote. So the physician monk Jehan Dotariv tells his adopted daughter Zenaide, is that, am I
You
pronouncing it
know what?
correct?
Honestly, it's funny because I think in your last episode, you guys were talking pronunciations, and that's
Yes.
for like, um, I'm always running up against my really flat Western New York A's that I've never dropped. So like I'm always struggling for pronunciations too. I think in French it would be uh Zanid, because you pronounce that umlauted E like like a sliding E. But you could
Yes.
also do probably like the way you would say like Adelaide, you could probably say Zanaid too in English.
Okay.
And that would be kosher, I'm sure. And usually that's people are always asking me because I cover a lot of time periods. They're always like, how do I pronounce this? And I'm just like, well, it depends. Like who do you ask? And so like I too am very loose with pronunciation and I'm not going to spend a lot of time correcting people. If you hit it
Okay.
somewhere, yeah.
Well,
But yeah,
there's me at the end of my audiobook
yeah.
narrator
It's just
career.
like well, that's how I always feel, particularly and it's hard because a lot of times in the past I've been dealing with like Greek and Roman names and some
Mm,
of that depends on well, how exact in the Greek do you want to be? Are you going to take like the BBC British pronunciation or like the strict Greek, which no one's going to understand because
right.
like all the letters are different. So,
Okay.
yeah.
All right. So Zenaid, you can do it sort of like,
Yeah,
okay.
that's
Okay.
let's go with that.
All right. So
Let's
the
just
phys
roll with it.
let's just roll with it. So the physician monk Jehan d'Autrive tells his adopted daughter Zenaide, a foundling once discarded out of superstition and fear. Taught medicine by him, despite her sex as much as her disabilities, Zenaide's unconventional destiny will take her from her childhood in a Norman monastery to medieval Paris and the royal court of Louis VII. But in this new world of chivalry and courtly love, pious Louis receives a dramatic prophecy that will send his young physician to Jerusalem and the chaotic eastern kingdom known as Ptolemaic, beyond the sea. Although dispatched merely as a healer for Baudouin, Jerusalem's leprosy-struck king, Zenaide soon finds herself drawn into the century-long conflict between the Crusader kingdom and its Muslim adversaries led by the charismatic Salah al-Din. To protect everything that she has come to love in this land of divisions, Zenid will need all her ingenuity and empathy to navigate the treacherous factions within Outremer's borders and without. But can she do so without losing her soul or her life? And I don't have to tell anyone listening how fraught a period and a place Jerusalem during the Crusades is to write about, much less to write two main characters, one of whom has Hansen disease, what has formerly been called leprosy, and the other of whom has albinism and mutism.
Yeah.
Um, and just to do so with such grace and just such a moving love story. And also just you're so freaking fantastic at like making history a rich tapestry where I'm just like sitting there like, oh, I feel like I'm right there with them. Like I can feel the Jerusalem sun baking on my neck, and it's fantastic. So go out and check it out. That's what I'll
Well,
say.
thank you for that, Jessica, because that's all I can ever hope for when I'm writing is for people because I understand that history and historical fiction is still kind of a niche genre. It has an audience, but it's kind of an intermittent audience. It's a lot of people don't think it's for them. And my goal is always to write books that will enjoy whether they are specifically fans of historical fiction or not and like to bring people into that. So that's wonderful. Thank you.
No problem. Well, I feel like I've done a whole lot of talking, so if you wouldn't mind, would you kindly do me the honor of introducing the comp title we'll be discussing today?
Oh, sure. Um, Pull it up right here since my hands are free. We have it right here. It is Hilary Mantel's 2009 historical fiction novel, Wolf Hall. It is the first of a trilogy of books that she wrote about Thomas Cromwell, who is kind of usually a side character in other Tudor novels. If you've read any other Tudor novels, it is a thick field, let's say, of in historical fiction, right up there with like World War II fiction.
Oh, yes,
um,
and we have new stuff coming out all the time. The
yeah,
musical Six just debuted on Broadway, I think, like 2 seasons ago.
which is how I spent my pandemic. I was just listening to Six on like loop, basically. And I said it's a field that I like. Tudor fiction is something I'm interested in. It is such a packed field that I don't know if I will ever write in it, but it's interesting to read. Um, but Thomas Cromwell, for those who don't know, is he is a basically he's an upstart in a time where it's very difficult to be an upstart. He kind of comes from nothing and works his way as kind of a jack of all trades. He works for Cardinal Wolsey at first, and then when Wolsey falls, he kind of ingratiates himself with Henry VIII's main court, and spoiler alerts, it doesn't go well for him the way it doesn't go well for pretty much everyone in Henry's court eventually. But uh, the the trilogy explores that, but Wolf Hall is kind of like we meet him at the start of his royal career. Like, so he's actually like in his I'm sorry, early 40s, I think, at
Mhm.
the start of the novel. Excuse me. But he we see his rise basically, and I don't know. I found it really interesting. We were talking when we were going to make this the Count title that I hadn't yet read the final book, The Mirror and the Light, which came out about 2 years ago.
I still haven't read it.
I That's what I spent the fall doing because it's like I should read that first. But it was really interesting to read that and then go back to the first book, which I had to look it up because I was like, why don't I remember very much about the specifics of this book before I reread it to prepare for this? And I was like, oh, it's because I read it 10 years ago. I read it in
Right.
about 2013 or something like that. So, but it was very interesting to come back to the first book after going to the end and coming back. So,
Right. Well, and it's also just having read it recently as well. It's a large book. It's and I love like a thick book that you can just really
mhm,
sink into. I know a lot of people today, the fashion of the times is to read as many books in a year as you can. I'm
mhm,
such I don't know if I'd call myself a contrarian, but I am in that I'm like, I'm going to read a book however long it takes me to read the book. And it's written in such a style that it's almost like a dreamlike. There
mhm.
it'll just be pages and pages of gorgeous narration, and then you'll sink into a little bit of dialogue, with very little dialogue tagging or anything like that, and then we pop back into narration. So it is also sort of like, okay, wait, when did this happen, and what it just like this escalating rise of his. And yeah, the fact that he's such an upstart in a time that it's difficult, he feels very much like the fixers that also became popular
Yeah.
in pop culture at the same time that 2009 that Wolf Hall was published. I think as I'm reading of, oh gosh, what's his last name? Frank Underwood in the
Mhm.
House of Cards novels that then became a BBC series that then became a Netflix series. And, that just, that there's an undercurrent to this man, and we're not really entirely sure why he's doing all of these things, aside from obviously self-gain. But
Yeah.
it's a fantastic novel. Um, and I wondered, just to sort of launch, and since we're talking about comparative titles here, if you could tell us a little bit about how your writing journey began, because I know you talk in your author biography about being a lifelong reader and a lover of words, and how about almost 5 years ago, you decided, well, let me return to my love of writing. I've dabbled with it in the past. I want to come back to it. And I know that you have carved out a niche for yourself in the indie world. Did you ever query agents and use Wolf Hall or something else as a comp title? Um, do you use comparative titles in your Amazon ads or jacket copy? And basically just asking about the origins of your writing story, and how comparative titles like Wolf Hall or other historical novels have fit into that.
Yeah, that's honestly, the whole thing is a great question. um, the short answer is I probably needed this podcast when I started because I don't consider myself particularly good at using comp titles. I am the person you're talking about in your intro where it's like this is to help people learn how to do this. um, when I started out, I started trying to write a full book a little earlier, like again, about probably about 10 years ago. So right around the time I was reading Wolf Hall, which just happens to be a coincidence mostly. Um, because I had gotten to the point where I was almost 30 at that point, and was like, you like writing, you've never tried to do it really seriously. I was an English lit major because I didn't want the pressure of an English writing major. I was too jittery about being on deadlines. Um, but what I did, so I just sat down and I was like, let's see if I can even do it. Like with no real end goal in place. Like, can I write a beginning, middle, and an end? And the result of that was my first book, The God's Wife, um, which I probably finished about a year later because I really kind of set myself like, can you do it in about a year kind of thing.
For those who don't know God's Wife, just a brief, like one or two
Uh,
sentence little like tag for it.
Basically, it's about Cleopatra's little sister, Arsinoe, who is a historical person who frankly did some pretty amazing things. We don't know a lot about her, and I it's focusing on that time period of Cleopatra and Julius Caesar just from a different perspective, which is another thing that I appreciate about Wolf Hall because Tudor literature is such a well-trod ground, it's hard to kind of find a new angle. And I think Hilary Mantel did a really good job with that by focusing on a lesser thought of character, particularly in terms of like because of class and things like that. Obviously, Arsinoe is a princess, but she's very much like she's way away from any shot at the throne, and it's about her navigating the situation between what her sister's doing, what Rome's doing, and all that
Mm.
stuff. Um, but then after I did, and like honestly, the finished novel is not terribly dissimilar from what I ended up publishing, but I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know anyone in publishing. I didn't have any experience publishing. Um, I did do some querying, probably pretty badly. I'm guessing it didn't work out. Um, some of that was again my inexperience, I'm sure. Some of that is it's hard to be a first time writer and get somebody's attention, even an agent's attention, let alone a publisher's attention.
Mm.
And like you, I like long books. I write long books, and it's also I talked specifically to people in publishing who are like, no publisher's going to publish something that long as a debut novel, which is fine. So I still didn't know quite what to do. And my wife saw a flyer at one of our local community colleges for just like a 4 session seminar with a local author who'd published both traditionally and self-publishing. And the seminar was specifically about self-publishing. And I was like, well, I don't have any other ideas. So I went and I got some really good information from her, mostly just on where to go and like who to talk to who is not going to like rip me off or steal my work. And that's how I found Reedsy, and that's how I found Jessica on Reedsy. Reedsy is great.
Reedsy is fantastic. Reedsy, they are not paying us to say this.
No, I'm
Um,
sorry.
but reedsy.com is this fantastic resource where, especially if you're an indie author, it's a great place to find freelance editors, freelance graphic designers, freelance publicists and marketers, I think, as well at this point.
Yeah,
They even have like a,
I
oh,
think they
go
have
ahead.
agents now even. I
My
think, I'm
goodness.
sorry.
Yeah. So they've really, because when I joined them as an editor, you can have a profile on there. It was 2016, so 8 years ago now.
Mhm.
Um, it was much smaller, and it really has like accrued so many great resources in the process in the intervening decade. But yeah, so you decided, okay, well, self-publishing is going to be the route for me, and I think that like what I always tell freelance clients when I am freelance editing is that um, self-publishing is what you make it. And,
Exactly, yeah.
it can be as low quality or as high quality as you want it to be. And yours are just always packaged so beautifully. The covers are just devastatingly gorgeous. And yeah, I think that you have the sort of level head on your shoulders that you need to do that sort of thing.
Well, and that's really, and I tell that to people all the time because you said I really do believe anyone can write. I believe anyone can put out a book in the climate. it's hard. Like, I'm not going to pretend that like it's a financial, you know, bonanza.
Right.
You know that as someone who's publishing more traditionally than I am, like it's you didn't get to quit your day job
No.
necessarily. Um,
No.
but if you're passionate about writing and you're passionate about books, I think it can still be really rewarding. And
Mhm.
you're absolutely right. It's some of it is what you put into it. Um, you can do it extremely cheaply, which is wonderful.
Mhm.
I think it's worth allocating resources
Yes.
wisely for you. Like, for example, is that I think it's good to pay an editor. Like, I'm not saying that because Jessica told me to. It's
I
just
put
I
the
think that
screws to her.
yeah, she's like, tell them that they need an editor. Um, it's it's just good to have because you'll have people in your life who probably you can con into reading your book as beta readers and things like that.
Yeah.
But it's good to have somebody who's one removed from you, who's not like who doesn't feel like they have to pander to you because they're your parents or your friends. Um, just to have an outside opinion,
Yeah.
basically. And aside from just, oh, and you didn't put any prepositions or articles in this sentence and you need to fix that. Like that's great too. I need that help a lot. But
Right.
it's also good just to have another perspective. Covers are another thing. Like you can slap one together in 5 minutes yourself with some Photoshop. I think that's one of the places you don't, and you still don't have to spend a ton of money. Draft to Digital just acquired the people I've been working with for years on my covers, selfpubbookcovers.com.
Oh, nice.
They're great too. I mean, you can get things relatively inexpensively, but from an actual artist, you don't. I like using them because, particularly as AI has become more of a thing, to try to avoid that at all costs.
Yeah. I'm glad you said that, because it can feel like such an easy way to cut corners. But thank you for, supporting real live human artists.
But that's
um,
another great thing about
yeah.
about doing it this way because I can you can as an indie author because you have to do it all yourself. You have the choice to who you use and who you
Yes.
support, and like it's been great to support some smaller businesses and people freelancing just like you because then it just kind of spreads the wealth around, and that's really great.
Absolutely. So just like publishing, we've talked about self-publishing, we've talked about trade, how that spans a gamut. I feel like historical fiction, for as much as it's an intermittent genre, as you said, also spans across genres and categories. You have obviously historical romance is huge, especially of the Regency period.
Yeah.
Um,
Speaking of another period that I feel like I might not end up in too much just because
right. I
it's
was
kind of oversaturated.
I was thinking the other day, I was like, how many dukes, earls, like if we assume that there isn't a multiverse, they're all just in the same universe. Have we just like saturated that, oh, what is the book called? The book that has all the all the landed gentry in it in England. I just feel like
Oh yeah.
all the romance novels have just like covered
Someone's
that at
just
this
flipping
point.
through the
Like
pages trying to find somebody who hasn't
there's
been
no
hooked
more
up
dukes,
yet.
guys. There's no more. We're all done. We've run out of land to give them. Um
Oh, that's funny.
but so there's historical romance, there's action adventure, mystery, fantasy, and also literary, more upmarket things. And Hilary
Mhm.
Mantel, if you say that name, you immediately think Wolf Hall and those books.
Mhm.
I think she wrote something like 12 novels over the course of her like 3 4 decade career, but she won the Booker Prize twice
Yeah, I
for
couldn't believe that.
yeah, for Wolf Hall and then for Bring Up the Bodies, which is the second book in the series, in the trilogy, I believe.
Mhm.
And I think so. Obviously, the Booker Prize is a very literary prize that's given out, and I think that your work has fantastical elements, but it also has that literary bent to it, like gorgeous sentence craft happening. And what do you think, Sarah, elevates historical fiction into the realm of the literary?
Um, yeah, because it's a huge genre, and like certainly literariness kind of carries a certain connotation with it. And to be clear, I read across historical fiction at all levels. Like even just in the, I was thinking when I was trying to just think about Wolf Hall in its kind of milieu, all the different kinds of Tudor books. Like you have kind of stuff that's maybe a little middle of the road, like Philippa Gregory's books, which I also love. The other Boleyn girls,
Hmm.
great. Those are wonderful. But people do tend to think of them differently than they think of Wolf Hall. And I think it's kind of a breadth issue, so to speak. You can make a story that's very individual, like a very individual focused, but I think what elevates it to more of a literary is either like a wider view of what's happening in the greater context, your wars and peace, if you will. um, but you don't have to go that big either. I think also if you're trying to say something about the human condition, I think, and
Mm.
like not every book needs to do that, and not every book has to be about you know, big concepts. But I think that's where the literary bent comes from. In Wolf Hall, I know Hilary Mantel spends a lot of time talking about almost England as a character, like,
Hmm.
talking about the geography and like kind of they said there's a whole section that's called like the occult history of England
Yes.
and like kind of its more mystical roots, not necessarily taking those seriously, but bringing them into the story to talk about. And I think that's where you start crossing into what people consider literary. And again, that's very subjective, so I'm sure other people would have different opinions.
I like this working theory you're building here, though, about the scope being the thing that makes it literary. Because if you think it, and I have to confess, I'm not as familiar with Philippa Gregory's work as perhaps I should be talking about this. But when I think about Tudor historical fiction that isn't literary, I think there's such a focus on the court and on court
Hmm.
intrigue specifically, and which wife is in and which wife is out, and all of that sort of thing. Um, and when you just focus on the microcosm of court, that's not the real workaday English life. I just recently reread the passage where Cromwell is thinking about growing up as a working class boy, and he'd dig coins out of the silt of the river and go home and ask his father, who was a horrible man, like beat him and everything. He's like, which king is this? And he's like, it doesn't matter.
Hmm.
It's still it's a coin.
Yeah.
And to show the scope of not just the geography of England, but also the historical moment that England is going through, this revolution in the church, um, and then also just the class distinction is fascinating that she's doing that. I think you're right that but also, you can go broad like she does, or you can, as you said, have the scope of the human condition, where the scope is not an external one, but one where you're delving deeply into a character's mind, which I think I would say, as a reader of your work, tends to be the experience that you have with yours. You have a character's circumstance. I would. Flight of Virtue might be on the same level as being the external scope, but with several of the other ones, I think there's that internal as well of here's a character and their circumstances and what that means for them and how they grow and how they consider themselves and their place in the world because of it.
Yeah. And a lot of times that will, because I agree with you, I think it depends on kind of what the story you want to tell is too, because the books in my God's Wife series are a little more internal just because it's not a moment in history where there are big external changes, but they're not, I wouldn't call them systemic changes. Like the way I talk about slavery in the God's Wife books is very different than how I talk about it in Flight of Virtue. And that's
Hmm.
just because in Flight of Virtue, like slavery is a problem, whereas like nobody except slaves are going to think that slavery is a problem in ancient Rome. It's just not, that's not where the zeitgeist is unfortunately at.
Yeah.
So like it's great to have characters be obviously against slavery, but if you do that in an ancient Rome story, it becomes kind of anachronistic and like that almost potentially will pull your reader out of the story. So like that's when like you focus on internality as opposed to well, we need to talk we need to talk about race and slavery or something, or for just an example of that, you know.
Mm,
But
mhm.
I think it really just depends on how you want to frame your story. Some stories are about the big picture and just other stories are not.
Interesting, interesting. I think also just going back to speaking of the scope, um, I keep thinking about how Wolf Hall is about the change from the Catholic Church to the C of E, the Church of England. And I think I wanted to ask you what the most iconic passage is for you in Wolf Hall, because as I said, it has these it's dreamlike overall, but then just really seems to have these peaks, where
Mhm.
it's just like becomes full scene. And for me, it's interesting. It's more of like a scene in flashback. It's Thomas Cromwell as a child notices a crowd building in the streets and he's like, what's going on? And he witnesses this horrific moment when an old woman is burned as a heretic, and just the crowd becoming like this feral group thinking mass. And it's just, I think, not only, pardon the pun, but seared into my mind because of it being just so imagistic, but I think also because it gets to the literary theme of the book, which is that these things we were burning people for a generation ago are now things that we're saying, oh yeah, no, this is fine. In
Yes.
fact, like by the end of it, like Tyndale's New Testament, which was, if you had it, you were going to the tower, is like being read in court and things like that. So
Yeah,
uh
no, absolutely, because religion is obviously a huge part. In fact, I think just trying to prepare for some of this, I was reading through some just basic online reviews of people for these books, and some people really don't like what they see as Hilary Mantel's clear personal pro-Protestant bias in these stories. But I think it's appropriate for the character of Cromwell. So like, what and unfortunately she died a couple years ago, so like we can't
yes.
interrogate her on her religious beliefs. I mean, growing up Church of England, that's probably an accurate description,
Weren't
or at
her
least.
I have to admit I was doing a little bit of digging into her biography before this. I think she was born into a Catholic family.
Oh, really? I didn't
Yeah.
know that. So
Yeah.
like, no, so that's even more, honestly, to me, that's even more interesting. That's real,
Right.
like, but then she's probably somebody who's just had experience with the flux. No, I absolutely agree with you on the heretic burning scene. Clearly she thought it was important too, because mild spoilers, she brings that back in the mirror and the light. Like
Oh,
that's a huge,
okay.
she does a huge, basically it's very similar, honestly, and like clearly she wanted to emphasize it and it was important and she saw it as formative in Cromwell's character. So like she kind of puts an underline underneath it in the series, which I so I mean you were right to be drawn to it. Um the other scene, because when I say that's probably the biggest one, I would say. But interestingly, I think the other scene that really stuck with me kind of ties into that. And for me, it's just um a lot of Wolf Hall is kind of a tension and conversation between Thomas Cromwell and Sir Thomas More. Um,
Mhm. Who wrote
and
Utopia and was a
Utopia.
big proponent of the Catholic Church, if I
Well, he's
recall my history correctly.
yeah, I believe so. Well, regardless of what he thought, he's a Catholic saint now, so they certainly thought
Oh,
so.
okay. Well,
Yeah,
there you have it.
because um, again, mild spoilers, he will get beheaded by Henry VIII for not agreeing to sign the oath of allegiance to Henry as the head of the English Church.
Right.
Um, Moore's motivations for doing that are varied. I mean, he certainly thought it was a religious, like he thought that it was a religious point. Whether that was all show or not, who knows? But there's a tension between those two characters in this story, which I think draws on, again, going back to the vast pool of Tudor literature. I feel like Wolf Hall is having a direct conversation with Robert Bolt's play A Man for All Seasons,
Mm.
which is about Thomas More. Like, and in that, Thomas More is the hero, and he is, the rational man against irrationality, and everybody else is crazy, and he's the only one who's got his head screwed on tight. Um, I feel like Hilary was like, you know what? We're going to take this from another perspective. I'm going to take Thomas More down a peg or two before I let him have his little martyrdom. And that's okay because I like that. Again, I think one of the real strengths of Wolf Hall is its willingness to see things from another perspective. And
Mhm.
like we're so used to being told that, Thomas More was, he was so smart and he knew everything and like he was definitely on the right side of history. So it's interesting to see that. But what really sticks with me in the book is Cromwell's been ducking More for like the first half of the book, being More keeps trying to get him to come over to dinner. Cromwell doesn't want to come over to dinner. He finally does, and they have just the worst meal of all time.
Such
Like
an awkward meal.
it's awkward, and it's like More is just like nitpicking at all the women in his family at the table. It's so uncomfortable, and it's clear that Cromwell is uncomfortable too, along with us. But it's such a juxtaposition because like, oh, Thomas More, like he's like, he never does it. He's so good to his daughter. He taught her all the stuff he taught his sons, even though that was weird for the time. And like even his relationship with his daughter Margaret, who it's it's complicated. I have experience with that with Flight of Virtue with
Mhm.
Aaron. It's very Aaron Burr and Theodosia
Yeah.
Burr adjacent. It's a weird relationship, but I think Mantel really plays up the weird angle of it, like how even she's not completely comfortable with her father because like it's just such an odd dynamic. But anyway, it's like the most uncomfortable dinner party. And
Oh yeah.
there are a couple uncomfortable dinner parties in this
Yes.
book. But
It's but it's high strangeness. Like his wife, his second wife, it has like a monkey, a pet monkey that she's holding throughout the dinner. And she only like will whisper to it because she's so browbeaten by Sir Thomas More. And it's interesting though. I wanted to go back to the point you were talking about what we privilege when we're talking about systemic issues in history. And obviously, from a 21st century perspective, no one is going to condone something like misogyny or something like slavery. But at the same time that Thomas Cromwell can sense how uncomfortable all of the women are, there are also points in the book in which the narrator is like, who knows what women think? There's one point even when Cromwell says, um, maybe he would have noticed a key point in the plot. Maybe he would have noticed this if he ever actually listened to women. She's not standing up on a soapbox in Speaker's Corner railing against how this entire system, this whole patriarchal system was against women. You can read between the lines and see how unfair it is, but that's not the point that this book is trying to make. Like that would be like taking the scope beyond the scope that this character has set up in it, within his perspective. I wanted to, because you mentioned you've used the phrase spoiler alert a couple of times, which I
yes.
love, but there's also an inherent humor to using that for historical fiction
Yeah.
because you can go, if you're reading a book about the Tudor dynasty or you're reading a book about the Reign of Terror, even if you're not familiar, you can go out and Google, you can go to the library and pick up a book and learn what's going to happen. So I wanted to ask you, and actually, like, there's this fantastic line I highlighted from Wolf Hall, which I think capitalizes on the dramatic irony of historical fiction. It's um it's speaking of when Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII's second wife, for whom he started the thing that was the proto Church of England, when she's enceinte with Princess Elizabeth, who becomes Elizabeth I. And the book says, the child in Anne's womb is the guarantee of no more civil war. He is the beginning, the start of something, the promise of another country. And like, well, you're not wrong, but also the guarantee of no more civil war. Well, if you know anything about British history, you first off have Mary becoming the Queen of Scots and Elizabeth being there with the English. You have the Spanish Armada and the war with England because of all of these different things. And then you have an actual civil war about a century later that like nearly destroys the country. So all of this to say, one benefit of historical fiction with dealing with a major event is that you can sort of do shorthand and you can sort of wink at the audience because not all readers will recognize the outcome that's approaching. But I wondered if, from a craft perspective, as a novelist, you could talk about like how you manipulate this for dramatic irony, but also you kind of have to toe the line of like, not every reader knows this stuff. Not every reader is going to Google this stuff or go to the library if they don't know about it. Um, Especially if it's a more nuanced, lesser known period of history, such as, I mean, I will admit I knew next to nothing about Crusade era Jerusalem when I was editing the Gourd and the Stars. So how do you toe that line of like what the reader is bringing to the table in their knowledge or lack of knowledge about historical events?
Yeah, it's honestly, it's one of the things that I have to spend a lot of time thinking about because my friends and family will tell you that I have very, very little perspective on what is quote common knowledge among people. I'm
I
the
feel like
person
this is
who,
a common historian perspective. You're like, of course everyone knows about the
yeah.
food blight of 1543. I don't know.
No, exactly. Like I am the person watching Jeopardy going, why does nobody know this answer? And my wife is sitting next to me going, nobody knows what that is except you. Um, so for me, sometimes in you can see it in my in my use of the spoiler alert, I have no idea. Also, it's hard for me to gauge how much people want to be surprised in a
Mhm.
historic. If they don't know, do they want me to tell them? Sometimes you kind of have to give stuff away, like Hilary Mantel, I love casts of thousands and in my
Yes.
books. And so sometimes to just lay out relationships, you have to sometimes give away future plot points if you want to be thorough. And I think she has the same problem in her with having to tell people things like, you know, if you don't know that Anne Boleyn's going to be queen, do readers want to know that or do they want to be surprised? And I think it's kind of a give and take. I Because I do plenty of other times where yeah, I'm like winking at the audience like look at, because I think that is something that can be fun about historical fiction where the audience is privy to things that the characters aren't necessarily privy to. Like I think people enjoy that to a certain extent. Like I think you have to be careful and not overdo it. You certainly don't want to be like elbows out, like, you know, nudging the audience going, because I think that's irritating too.
Yeah.
But with that, yeah, like I think she walks that line pretty well in this book with yeah, because the thing with Elizabeth is fun. I also I love the opening, it's maybe 3 or 4 paragraphs of the chapter because it goes right from Anne goes into confinement, and then the start of the next chapter, baby's
Yes.
out. I
God.
love that. I love the
Let me
opening of that chapter. Do you say do?
let me see if I can find it because I remember being like, my God, this is a master class in writing. Keep talking.
Oh yeah, no,
I will
absolutely.
look it up.
Um, I'll talk about while you're looking it up because I think it plays into something else I really like in Wolf Hall is that particularly when she's moving, she has a couple different parts in this book. When she's moving between parts, she tends to drop the audience in the middle of action. And I think that can be really powerful, and she does a really good job with that. Like the book opens with, we will learn in 3 paragraphs, it's Cromwell's father just beating the
Ever
blessedness out of
loving
him
crap
in the
out of him. Yeah.
street. And but like it starts with like basically like Cromwell's getting kicked in the head, and you're just like you're immediately kind of off kilter, and you're like, what's happening? What is this? What's going on? And then you learn it's his father, and you're like, oh my god, what's going to happen? It's a great way to draw the reader right into the action.
Hmm.
Did you
Okay.
find it?
I did. I did. And I think, well, I'll read it and then I'll go into what I think is so brilliant about it. So I'm going to read the last few sentences of the chapter before it. Or, sorry, I'm just going, indulge me, dear
Oh no,
listener. I'm going
absolutely.
to read the last paragraph of the chapter in which Anne is going into her confinement to deliver what everyone is assuming will be the heir apparent to the throne of England. And then I'm going to read the first 2 paragraphs of the chapter that follows. On August 26, 1533, a procession escorts the queen to her sealed rooms at Greenwich. Her husband kisses her adieu and bon voyage, and she neither smiles nor speaks. She is very pale, very grand, a tiny jeweled head balanced on the swaying tent of her body, her steps small and circumspect, a prayer book in her hands. On the quay, she turns her head, one lingering glance. She sees him, she sees the archbishop. One last look, and then, her women steadying her elbows, she puts her foot into the boat. And here's the first two paragraphs of the next chapter. It is magnificent. At the moment of impact, the king's eyes are open, his body braced for the éton. He takes the blow perfectly, its force absorbed by a body securely armored, moving in the right direction, moving at the right speed. His color does not alter. His voice does not shake. Healthy, he says. Then I thank God for his favor to us, as I thank you, my lords, for this comfortable intelligence. So you have this picture of almost like if the and I'm blanking on the director of The Crown's name, Peter Morgan, almost as
Oh
if
yeah,
Peter
yeah.
Morgan has written it, like Anne sailing to the barge that's going to take her to the rooms that are going to deliver to England the next glorious ruler given by God. And then you open the next chapter with it seems like Henry's in a sparring match or something like that. We think it's
Yeah.
just more of like his very boyish courts games, and then you realize that he's been slapped in the face with it's another daughter, and he's like, well, the baby's healthy, right? Like doesn't break, but you know that like behind his visage, like everything has changed. His feelings about Anne Boleyn, his feelings about the certainty of his line, like all of this stuff. So sorry. Okay, go
No,
ahead.
no, absolutely. Because I was just like I was just awash in the scene again because I have like notes in my book and I was just like, this is brilliant. Not only is just the jousting metaphor so wonderful, it's so appropriate for Henry, who
Yes.
loves jousting. That's like his whole deal. So like
Yes.
it was everything about it was so perfect. I was just like, oh, I'd love to have written this because like this is just amazing. And yeah, just everything about it is wonderful. And it's such a great way to kind of close that dramatic irony and be like, okay, now the characters are all caught up to where you all have been for the whole time, going like, ha ha ha, they don't know. Like,
Yes. There's also I've been reading from a craft level and to talk very briefly about sentence structure. I've been reading a fantastic craft book by Jane Allison called Meander, Spiral, Explode about different narrative structures and how we can manipulate them on sentence level and then also just on a meta-fictional level to convey what we're trying to do. And I think one thing that we're responding to is that last paragraph of the previous chapter is one or two very long grand sentences that like trail off and have this like dignity to them, almost like a train behind a ceremonial gown or robe or something. And then there's like shorter, more declarative, sharp sentences in the opening to the next one, the practicality of the impact, the fact that things have changed, and I think that it's that contrast that works so well there.
yeah. And Hilary Mantel is just she's a master of language just in this
Mm,
book. Like,
mhm.
and it's reading it particularly kind of doing a close reading the second time because I'm sure the first time I read it as anyone would just kind of flip through it. I was on the lookout for anything to talk about. So like I just her use of language is so amazing in particularly this book. Because she sets up this wonderful thing where characters talk differently, not in using she doesn't use like dialects or anything like that, but the way that Cromwell and his son and his nephews and his dependents at Austin Friars, his house, the way they talk to each other is significantly different than how characters talk to each other at court. And she doesn't do that with like real flowy language. She does it with sentence structure. When the boys at Cromwell's house are talking to each other, it's snappy dialogue. It's back and forth. It's witty. They're kind of trying to outwork each other. Um, the way Cromwell talks when he's at court feels much more stately. People are talking as you imagine people talk in a period drama, and it reemphasizes her focus on class, and I think it
Mhm.
narratively it does such a great job of doing that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. By the way, if you are listening to this live, please feel free to drop any questions or observations that you've had into the chat. I'm happy to share them with Sarah, and with other listeners later. Um, I completely agree, Sarah, about the use of language and yeah, the short snappiness of those conversations, and then just like the 9 layers of subterfuge in the court conversations as well. There are things you can't say in court, or there will be consequences. So there's always this layer of metaphor and wordplay also being used, I think, from time to time in like those conversations, that feel, and I'll ask about this a little bit later, but almost feel like, to me, this feels like a lost work of Shakespeare,
No,
because there are
absolutely.
times in her court scenes where I'm like, my God, like this feels like I'm reading something in the War of the Roses cycle or something, you know.
Yeah,
So
no, I totally agree. That's exactly how it comes off to me. And it hit me very hard both coming back to the series and The Mirror and the Light and coming back to this book particularly because it was really striking me in the third book and I was like maybe I'm reading too much into this, maybe this is more than but to see it back in the first book I was like oh no, this is extremely deliberate and she's doing a wonderful thing here
absolutely.
because sometimes things are happy accidents, like a lot of you can plan a lot of things but sometimes things just are going to slip in anyway.
And one other thing, and then I promise I'll stop being such a language nerd.
No,
Never,
I love it.
but for the time being. Um, she does do this interesting thing, and I still haven't really decided what I think is happening here with the narrator and the pronouns that they use. Specifically, there's this first person, sometimes singular, sometimes plural, sometimes even second person that comes in where the narrator will say, "We are there. I feel this. You would go through the woods like this." And it's like, okay, who is being spoken to here? Are we talking to Cromwell? Are we with Cromwell? Is Cromwell speaking to us? And then something that I had to get used to, especially as an editor who is often saying, like, hey, you have more than one person with he pronouns, buddy. Like, you might want to
Yeah.
mention which one is being spoken to here, where I'd be like, wait, Archbishop Wolsey is saying this? Oh, wait, no, it means Cromwell. Anytime he comes up and it's not really appended to some gentleman's name, it means Thomas Cromwell, which is almost like this Copernican heliocentric theory where like the world revolves around Cromwell. So I just wondered, like, any thoughts on this when you read it the first time? Were you like, what the heck? On this second read, what have you decided about it? I'm just very curious.
No, it is the number one complaint of reviewers on your Goodreads and your Amazon reviews.
Good Lord.
People
I
who,
bet the 1-star reviews are all just like,
yeah, I mean, some of it is reading. Um, part of it was just curiosity, but reading Hilary Mantel's like 1 and 2 star reviews was like really humbling because I'm just like, oh gosh, this is what people are saying about my books. Like, it's too long, too many characters with the same name. But aside from all that, the number one complaint is this use of her using he for Cromwell is probably the most divisive element of this entire series because it continues through the other 2 books. So if you
mm.
don't like it in the first one, just know that it's not going away. um, yeah, I'm with you. I don't know quite how I feel about it. I Partly because I can't quite decide what she was trying to do with it. I would love to stumble on an interview or something where she talks about it. It's not that I hate it. I didn't personally have a lot of trouble following it, but as a writer I'm just like, "Oh, but I can totally understand why people did." Like I don't think it's because I'm so much better than everyone else. I fell into it pretty quickly, but it is something that if you're not really used to people playing with sentence structure or things like that, you might find it might take you some time to catch up, I think.
Absolutely. I agree. I think that I I see the question. I'm going to ask your question here in a second. Thank you, audience member. Um, yeah, I was able to fall into it as well. But I do think, sometimes a reader just wants to, or, it's that echo chamber of this book is on all the bestseller lists. This book is getting critical attention. I guess I should see what the fuss is about. But you don't read in that genre most of the time, or you're not much of a reader, but you know that,
Mhm.
like, especially, let's say you're a British person and this comes out in 2009 and it's a point of national pride. Like the Booker Prize went to a very British novel, or I guess I should say a very English novel.
Which it
Uh,
doesn't do very often anymore,
no,
so,
no,
like,
because
yeah.
there's fantastic things happening beyond that tiny little island,
Absolutely,
you
yeah,
know?
like, it's wonderful for the record,
Yeah.
like
But yeah, so maybe you don't tend to read in this genre or very much at all, and then you are like, well, it's hard for me to get into it. That's a tough line to balance. But again, when you're reading literary fiction, there's usually going to be a little bit of a getting used to period like that. I don't, as a freelance, I guess what I'm observing, I didn't mind it so much, but as a freelance editor who's so used to giving that advice, there was part of my brain that was like, this is something I would have critiqued, but I think that there's a reason it's happening, and I too would love to either hear what authorial intent was or read like a doctoral dissertation on it,
yeah, because 'cause
because
I'm
I'm
sure,
sure
like
someone
yeah,
has talked
it's
about.
clearly intentional, like, it's not in the knowing the why is just a slightly beyond my ken to even envision. Because it is you and I have talked about, I personally really enjoy authors who try new things and, take big swings on style or subject,
Mhm.
and it's not always gonna work out, like, again, she must have convinced enough people that it was gonna work that,
Yeah,
like,
she's like,
they let
look,
it
we need this to happen.
and so she must have had a good reason,
Yeah,
and, but I don't know what that reason is. I don't think I could personally write in it. It seems difficult. It doesn't seem natural to me personally,
I
but
think she has some internal rule that I haven't figured out. It's like, since I'm in my Anglophilic era right now, just like talking all things British right now, it's like a cryptic crossword in the
Mhm.
Times. It's like there is an internal rule to it that you have to figure out to crack the code. And so I'm sure there's a reason that it is used that way, because sometimes even it'll be a point of dialogue and then the person who didn't speak it is also in that paragraph. So anyway, there's got to be
Yeah.
something to it. I'm going to dive into it later, and then I'll be like, attention, everyone, here's my theory.
Though I
Uh,
will say, just if people are feeling intimidated by this, I know I said that I really, for the most part, could follow it. There was one scene where I did have to backtrack because I realized I had misimagined what was happening.
yes. Yeah.
And it's the opening scene of a part where Cromwell has gone to see Catherine of Aragon, who's been
Yes.
banished from court, and Princess Mary. I got through the first page of that, and I knew Cromwell was there because he was our point of view character, but I thought he was kind of off to the side, and I thought the man speaking was Henry. And it
Mhm.
wasn't until I got to the second page where they were talking directly to Cromwell that I realized he was alone, and I was just like, oh, so I had to go back and read that page. So like it clearly is something that's not, yeah, it's not perfect. Even a pretty savvy reader might get thrown occasionally by what's happening
Right.
or who's there.
Yes, absolutely. Well, we do have an audience question, and I think this is a good transition away from Mantel and a bit more into the work of the guest author today. Um, Speaking of your novel that just came out, The Gourd and the Stars, the audience member asks, why did you decide to write about Jerusalem? Like The God's Wife, were you inspired by a historical figure? And this is coming to us from audience member Grace.
Oh, and that's a really good question because I mean, up until pretty recently, I have some academic background in medieval literature, but it's not a period that I considered myself especially attracted to write about. Particularly, honestly, the Crusades, particularly because I don't particularly find warfare very interesting. I think, particularly in fiction, battles are very repetitive. You can do that in a military history book, but I find if every other page is a battle, you kind of end up with this. There's only so many ways
Especially,
you can
es-
swing a sword.
yeah,
So
and
like,
especially in that period in time, there's only so many military maneuvers to discuss.
Yeah, it's like, are people on their horses or have they been knocked off and they're on the ground? So for a long time, I didn't really have an idea for a medieval novel. And this one very specifically, I've talked about this with people. Um, again, probably when I was pretty early in my writing journey, and I didn't even consider writing it at the time, but I was attracted to this particular moment in Palestine and Jerusalem's history, uh, from Ridley Scott's Kingdom of Heaven, the 2005
Hmm.
movie when it came out. Um, I didn't, at the time, I knew very little about the period. I didn't know anything, but it was the kind of movie where, yeah, it piqued my interest. I was looking things up, going like, is this true? Did this happen? How did this happen? And very specifically with the figure of the king of Jerusalem at this time, Baldwin the Fourth,
Hmm.
um, because in the movie he is depicted with leprosy. And when I saw that, I was like, is that accurate? Did that happen? Did they let that? Because again, I had the same perspective that most people do, baseline of, oh, they locked people away who had that. Like they didn't let, like they wouldn't let them rule the kingdom. They wouldn't let them stay in their house, so kind of being brought to the period through that character and learning more about what happened to him, what happened to other people with leprosy at the time, and how they were treated, how medicine treated them, how society treated them. And like most things in history, it's complicated, but that leaves you room as a writer of fiction to play. Like I love finding holes in the narrative, or because that's where you can add a story or where you can
Yes.
expand upon a story. Like it's no I actually think it's difficult to write in Tudor times because there's so much out there, and like
It's been
everyone
mapped out. Yeah.
everyone thinks they know everything. It's like that's one thing I like writing in kind of the later ancient past, because there's lacuna in what happened here, what happened to this person, and learning kind of the ins and outs and being able to bring that nuance to a different audience who, again, is taught by popular culture that like people with leprosy are ringing bells to clear the streets, and this is how this is how people treated each other in the crusading Middle East. And it was all bad, and there was a lot of bad stuff obviously, but there was also a lot of compromise because there had to be, basically. So
Right.
not always
Right.
not always for altruistic reasons, but like just for basic, you
Oh
know
yeah.
yeah.
One thing I think you captured is there's the perspective that the people back home in France have of the Crusades. And then there's what is happening on the ground, where there are, I think one of my favorite characters in the novel is Salah al-Din, and just this relationship that the Christian king of Jerusalem and the Muslim leader of, am I correct in what is his group called? Are they the Saracens? Am I correct in thinking that, or am
Yeah,
I
it's
wrong?
a no,
Please
they are
correct
definitely
me if I'm wrong.
no, they are that's what they would have been called by people in Europe,
Okay,
because
yes, it's
because
not
they
what
weren't
they would
really,
have called themselves.
probably not, just because they didn't really have the term Muslim generally. Like
Right,
Saracen was a kind of a catch-all for anyone who was Arab or not Christian, and even some of the Christians probably fell into the Saracen
right, yeah.
delineation, because
I
there is a
hate an umbrella term, by the way. That's why I'm like, I hope I'm
yeah,
using the correct terminology.
that
Please forgive me, anyone who, like,
yes,
I apologize if I'm speaking. It's not out of like cruelty, it's out of ignorance, and I apologize for my ignorance.
yeah. And some of it is also just, to be clear, I am what like real historians would call an independent scholar. So like I do read a lot to write these novels, but I don't pretend that I have degrees in these subjects. This is what I hope is a semi-intelligent person's amalgamation of the available scholarship.
Yeah,
So like my words should not be taken solely as authority. The best I
right.
can give you on any of these topics is I can promise you it's complicated. Like,
Yes. Absolutely. Well, and actually, I'm curious, as an independent scholar, what is your research process like? Because your original, one of your honorary comp titles, which I feel is more definitely a research title, was about King Baldwin the Fourth. And I was like, oh, if people are going to need interlibrary loans to find this book, they might not be able to read along, like all of that.
They might
Um,
want to not want to do homework before this.
yeah,
Like,
probably not. I'm sorry.
no, it's
Um,
absolutely true.
But I have to imagine that even, as an independent scholar, your research process seems relatively extensive. Like I've said, there's always a richness to your novels. You seem to have a good sense of what people are wearing, what people are eating, how transportation is working at the time, the ins and outs of court life, working class life. Um, so what is that research process like? Are you on JSTOR all day, every day? Like, what
Just
is
yeah,
going
it's kind of a whole combination of things. Usually what I'm looking for is like too niche for like my local library, bless them. They do the best they do the best they can to help me. Um, but I do, yeah, JSTOR Internet Archive is great, honestly, for particularly if you're trying to do things on a budget. Sometimes particularly with this last book, there is so much really great current scholarship happening in medieval studies. It's really benefiting from an expansion of who's doing the studying, what the focuses are.
Mhm.
It's really great. Unfortunately, that means there's a lot of great books I wanted to read that were brand new, and they assumed that I was like a university library, so they were like
Right.
$100. So it's a lot of sometimes it's a lot of me scouring all sorts of booksellers trying to find anybody who will sell it to me for less than less than the list price. Um, and a lot of it is also just you picking up a book and oh look, there's a footnote about this. Oh, I should read that book. And like it's just a kind of an it's got its own momentum after a while. It sounds silly to people who aren't used to thinking about it this way, but a lot of times I start out on a Wikipedia
Hmm.
article and then just
Go down to the primary
go down
sources.
to the primary sources, go down to the references. Not everything you're going to find there is great, but usually, particularly in historical stuff, which is not, you know, I know usually people are used to thinking about like, oh, celebrities' pages are being like turf warred by people. Um, Usually the information is solid. Like it's not you're not going to be led astray by like crackpot theories and things like that. Um, but like yeah, particularly as a jumping off point, if I just don't know where to go, if you go on Baldwin the Fourth's Wikipedia page, here I have it right here. The Leper King and His Heirs is the primary source for that page, and that's how I stumbled into this book.
Mm.
That's one I did have to break down and buy, which is good because I was writing in the margins a lot in that one. Um, and some of that is not just oh the Wikipedia page was drawn up by someone who read this book. There isn't a lot of dedicated scholarship to him. Um,
Right.
there's a lot of stuff circling him. He's obviously mentioned a lot because he was king at a kind of crossroads moment in the kingdom's history. But for a variety of reasons, there aren't a lot of people focusing on him. Bernard Hamilton is one of the few people who is.
Mhm.
Routledge is currently in the middle of doing a series of small texts about each ruler of the kingdom of Latin kingdom of Jerusalem, and they skipped over him to write about Sibylla, which I found really interesting.
Wow.
Which
Wow.
which is only interesting because like, and I read that Sibylla book, but at the same time, I cannot emphasize how much we do not know about her. Like
Mm.
she leaves very little. There's very little specific imprint. We don't know anything about her reign because she seems to have given over most of it to her husband,
Mhm.
Guy de Lusignan. Um, so like we don't know anything about her, and we know more. We know more about Baldwin when we know about her, but people are more interested in writing about her. I don't know if that's left over. I talk about some in an introduction in the Gourd and the Stars. Some of that is just ableism, frankly.
Mhm. Yeah.
He is seen as a bit player in his own life, Baldwin, where any decision that is made during his reign, it's somebody else. It couldn't possibly be him making that
Like
decision.
he's just a figurehead because he
Yeah.
happened to have leprosy.
Yeah, which is just it, which is strange to me because I said when through my research, it's just there's too many factors at play for that to be the only reason. The Kingdom of Jerusalem did not work like other medieval kingdoms. It just by virtue of it's kind of a stranger in a strange land situation for the crusading knights who stayed and became the ruling family of that. um, People were dying of diseases they'd never had contact with before, so there weren't a lot of there wasn't a lot of like the crown is being passed to the oldest son because the oldest son was dead, or
Yeah.
they didn't have any surviving children. So it's a lot of nephews, cousins. Like the crown's always like sliding slightly around as it gets passed. Baldwin's one of the very few of the kings of Jerusalem who inherited directly from his father. And that was
Right.
a choice that his court made. They made it when he was 13 and he had already been diagnosed with leprosy at that point. So like they made this this was a conscious decision that the court made that they could have this was not male only inheritance. They could have just given it to Sibylla, who was both older and healthy.
Hmm.
They could have passed it to Raymond of Tripoli, who was one of the counts, and the reason he was a cousin. But like Baldwin was the consensus candidate, and he remained that throughout his reign. There were multiple points where other people were pushed forward, and nobody could agree on anybody else. So like that speaks to someone who must have done enough to make a case for himself, as
Right.
opposed to what people necessarily have said prior in the record, which is just, yeah, oh, he was just there, he was sickly. Anything William of Tyre tells you about him is just exaggeration, because William of Tyre is the main primary source for a lot of this information, and he was Baldwin's tutor, and so
Yeah. A
clearly had
very like
a vested
avuncular sort of
interest.
relationship in
Yeah,
your
so
novel between the two
yeah,
of them. Yeah.
which is just and again, that's just a sense I got from
From
reading
reading.
William of Tyre's work. Like it just felt like someone like he does care. You cannot. I certainly don't claim that he doesn't have any biases, but to act like everything he said was made up or just propaganda, I think that's taking things a little too far. And that's what you get a sense from when you're researching. It's like even with primary sources, how far do you take it? Sometimes the answer is, oh yeah, we're gonna go all the way just because it's fun for the novel. Like I do that a lot with stuff in The God's Wife, because like Suetonius is just fun.
Yeah.
Sometimes you just have to spread gossip, but
Yeah.
like you have to also understand that just because something is a contemporary primary source doesn't always mean it's reliable either. And the same thing
Right.
with scholarship. You read and you draw your own conclusions.
Everyone's always going to have a bias. I think that's important for us to know when we're researching a historical novel. When we're searching online today, especially as what did Dr. Al call it recently, the enshittification of the internet.
Absolutely.
You have to think what's the bias, or like where is this information coming from? But I wanted to ask sort of a two-part question, bouncing off of your research. I love that you do primary source research. It's not just what Routledge's series says about what's going on, but you try to hunt and find those primary sources, hopefully ones that can kind of balance each other out, but also give you more of like a sense of how it actually was through at least one person's lens. I wanted to ask, number one, um, was there anything in your research for this novel or any of your novels that surprised you to learn? Like what your number one, oh, that's a cool fact that you learned in the research process was? And then more specifically about the Gourd and the Stars, I was curious if the character, the point of view character of Zainid, who is the doctor who is raised by a monk in a monastery, goes to the court of Louis the Seventh.
Yes, it's okay.
Yeah,
Scholars sometimes get that wrong too. I can't tell you how many family trees I've looked at where they've missed which Louis he
they're
is,
like
and I'm just,
sixth, seventh, who cares? But anyway, so was she based on a honest to God real person, or was she sort of your keyhole into like, here's how I can fictionally manipulate and show like what's going on behind closed doors in the court of Latin Jerusalem.
Um, yeah, I should make clear to your audience that Zenith is an OC. She's an original character. Um, she is not based on any specific historical person. She's kind of an amalgamation of ideas, I guess I would say, about, as I said, it you are not wrong if you are sitting here going, a woman doctor in medieval times. It Yes, it was unusual, but the part of history that this novel is set in, which is right before the start of the 1200s, is kind of the last hurrah for like unorganized medicine. Once you hit the 1200s, you really start getting the rise of the big medieval universities where like doctors are doctors who go to a university,
And
surgeons are the
healing
people
women and herbalists are witches.
is are witches. Your barber is a guy who cuts you open and doesn't know anything because he's a peasant, and that's where so like this is kind of this feels like almost the last moment where a character like her could kind of exist. They do pop up. um I am blanking on the name. It begins with a T. It's like Trutula. It's right on my shelf over there. Um, it's a medical text written in Italy a little later than this. Again, mid 1200s. Supposedly written by a woman, but this woman is kind of apocryphal. So like, we don't know if she was like a front, but it's full of like obstetric advice for midwives and like women. It's written for women, supposedly by a woman who may have written some of it. Some of it might be men using her as kind of a mask. um but the idea that they would think to do that suggests that women like her existed, and like that's kind of where Zenith comes from. She's not going to show up in any kind of record of the time, but I think women like her existed. The big one of her period is Hildegard of Bingen,
Yes.
who is the big medieval. Well, she's a polyglot. She does everything. She
Yes.
Medicine is actually one of the things she's least known for because she's considered one of the major medieval composers. She's her mystic visions are very important. But again, kind of using women like her as a departure point. Um, and just medicine was really interesting in Jerusalem at the time because unlike like in Europe, medicine at the Middle East was in the Middle East was much more diverse because you had a lot of different cultures bringing their medical knowledge together and hopefully using it for good for each other. Like obviously, Islamic medicine is amazing at this period. Like they're light years ahead of everybody.
Hmm.
But Jewish medicine is very learned at this point too. And there are a lot of there's a lot of all of them in here. Like I tried to um we know the name of one of Baldwin's physicians. It's Suleiman. He was an Egyptian born Jerusalem. I have him deceased in my novel. I actually couldn't find a death date for him. So like I'm sorry if he was alive. I pushed him out for my story. I apologize.
Get out of here.
I kept his brother Abul, but because I was doing that, I tried to acknowledge some of the other physicians who were working in the area. It's not clear from his name, but in my novel, I name drop Ibn Jamai, who was a chief physician for Salahuddin. He was Jewish. He had an
Mm.
Arabic name, but like he was coming from the Jewish medical tradition. There's another doctor who I name drop, and he is using Islamic medicine. I had Zanid was a good opportunity to have someone who would be open to different, perhaps what would be non-traditional to what she was coming from, because she's not
Mhm.
somebody who was formally trained in Milan or in a university of in Italy was the big one at this time, though
Mm.
Paris was gaining momentum.
Yeah. Um, so she is an amalgamation of different philosophies and people who would have existed at the time. Was there anything that surprised you when you were researching the Gourd and the Stars to learn, I mean?
Honestly, yeah, so much of it was just about Baldwin's experiences because it's been so generally not talked about. Like, just kind of one thing I really appreciated about The Leper King, Bernard Hamilton's book, is that it was just something, everything about it was just, again, that what we talked about with Hilary Mantel, shifting your perspective. The
Mhm.
minute I started to look at the historical record from a disease and disability standpoint as opposed to just the facts, it kind of opened, it just opened things up in a way that I don't, I guess was unexpected, but like the extent to which it opened up things, something I always point to is um William of Tyre goes out of his way in Deeds Be Done Beyond the Sea, which is his book about the history of Jerusalem, to talk about what an exceptional horseman Baldwin was. And I think a lot of times historians look at that and they're like, well, he's just saying that. Or like, he's just, this is just hype, you know. But like, once you start looking at it from a disability standpoint, for most of his adult life, Baldwin had very limited feeling and mobility in his arms and legs. And just having a baseline knowledge of what it takes to control a horse, I was like,
Yes.
the fact that he could sit on a horse at all and not just fall off continuously, yeah, he would have to be the best, the
A
greatest
fantastic horseman. Yeah.
horseman. So like just kind of getting that moment of like, it was like just a moment of clarity of just like, of course, yeah, like just like, oh, and then like stuff just kind of falls into place at that point once you start viewing it from, and that's kind of a lot of, I think, historical fiction writing is trying to find the why within, why are people doing this or why are people saying this about something, and just it's a nice surprise when it all comes together like that.
Yeah. I really love that, finding the why. I think that's when, regardless of genre, historical fiction or not, that is really when a novel hits me. Is like, why do I care about this? Why does this person care about this? The person being the character, I should clarify. No, I that resonates. That resonates true with me. I also just I think it'll be interesting to see, as someone who is not even an independent scholar, but very much like sitting there on the sidelines as an interested audience member who will like read historical fiction,
Right.
watch the docu-series, whatever, but isn't going out there. It'll be really interesting, I think. You're talking about perspectives that are coming up in historical research now, and I don't know, perhaps you know a bit more, but the perspective of disabled people, both people with disabilities in the historical record and people with disabilities who are researching the historical record, um, that's often a demographic that is swept under the rug.
Mm-hmm.
Or we just go, well, life would have been really hard for them before this modern convenience XYZ. Um, to say nothing of how the Americans with Disabilities Act barely makes you have to do anything to make places accessible. I speak as the child of a disabled person. But anyway, I think that it'll be really cool to see the things that come out of the historical record from that perspective that have to this point just not been excavated, for lack of a
Yeah,
better term.
absolutely. Because yeah, that's particularly when I said earlier about like just there's so much great research being done. That is the kind of stuff I'm talking about. It used to be just the, you had like regular research and then you had like maybe some women's studies stuff. And
Mhm.
like that's important. But yeah, particularly with early modern history, there's a lot of just really great work. Yeah, disability studies, queer studies
Mhm.
is seeing a real flourishing too, which is, and it's being, I think it's all being done very, for lack of a better term, organically. Like you'll read intros to people's books and they're going through all their methodology to show that they're not here just trying to impose modern or contemporary beliefs onto these, we're not saying that this person was queer just because we're looking for the record of queer people in the past. here's our methodology. This is how we're approaching it. And that's a lot of what's happening in disability studies too. Like, and it's just, that's the only reason, like, I spent more money than I probably wanted to on research for particularly this one, The Gourd and the Stars, but it felt really important to not only read the classics of the genre like Stephen Runciman's 3-volume History of the Crusades, but to read stuff that's people are talking about now, just again for different perspectives, because in part just because I am able-bodied. I am not writing about an experience that's mine. So anytime I'm doing that, I really do try to center it on people's experiences, who it is their experience, and not try to step on anyone's toes, because it's, you want diverse people in your books, but you also don't want to do it in a way that's not ethical for the people involved.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Um, well, I thank you for this conversation, like this very honest conversation about representation and about historical fiction and the way that it can sort of dovetail with those research efforts and um, perhaps a really as a historian, you're probably like, you've said things like it's complex. You're like, I don't want to tie it in a neat bow, but a nice way to tie this conversation in a bow might be that we've talked about these new areas of historical research that are finally stepping to the forefront. And then you talk about how historical fiction is finding that angle, finding that in that allows us to explore things that we think from the hegemonic historical record we know as fact, and we know who was there, the dramatis personae, and blah, blah, blah. And let's explore it from a slightly different angle. I think that that is such a fun, dare I say fun, if I'm allowed to say that, a fun and an interesting and an intriguing part of the genre and what keeps bringing me back to it and always makes it such a delight to read your work. Can I ask, what are you working on now? And then also, you mentioned this at the top, but if you can just remind listeners where they can find your books and where they can find you to like follow along with what's coming next for you.
Absolutely. Um, I have been telling people just like, ooh, Gordon the Stars took quite a bit out of me. So like I am moving at a slightly slower pace than I have
Take
the
your
past
time,
couple of
man.
years.
Take your
Um,
time.
yeah, which honestly is good. Like I was kind of, as I started this journey seriously about 6-ish years ago, and kind of have been just like bam, 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 which is great. Like, but at the same time, it's just like maybe I should slow down a little
Yeah,
bit
a
so I
book a
don't
year,
so
roughly
I
a book
don't
a year.
yeah, so I don't burn out. But because it's not, I don't think it's overly serious, but Lord and the Stars is kind of a serious book. Um, I needed something, like my brain was just like, let's just noodle on something potentially very very silly and not as serious. And it I had talked to you about this when the last of my God's Wife books, Children of Actium, came out, because you had phrased it to me, I think we're done. Are we done? And I said, maybe, like at the time I was like, maybe I left the door open for another book. And that's kind of what came out of the last year while I've been editing Gourd and the Stars. I didn't, part of it was I didn't want to commit to it because I didn't know what the angle was. I was like, well, um, there's a character in Children of Actium, Zosimi, who is a baby in that book. And I was like, it's probably her. She's probably the protagonist, but I didn't know for what. I was just like, does she have to go like deal with Caligula? Are we going to do Caligula? I don't
Oh
really want to
Lord.
do. I was
Brace
like, I really,
yourselves.
yeah, I was like, I really don't want to do Caligula. He's kind of a lot. Um, but it became increasingly clear that no, the obvious thing is Zosimi's father is Sejanus, who
Hmm.
is a huge player in later
Hmm.
history. He almost successfully dethrones Tiberius, who we're also not crazy about in those books, but we're. But I was like, oh no, it's obvious. This is, we got to bring things. Everything's always in these books always about family and dealing with cycles of violence in families. Oh, she's got to go deal with her dad. Oh, we have to go save Tiberius. But that's where we're at right now. Like it's kind of, but as I've been writing it, it's kind of bringing some things home to roost. For people who aren't familiar with the series, um, Jessica described it as a historical fantasy, which is how I would describe it. Um, the fantastical elements are the Egyptian gods are real. They have limited ability to influence events, but they are existent.
Hmm.
Um, but one of the things that has moved in the books is as Rome has deified its dead Caesars, be they Julius or Augustus, by the time frame of this fourth book, potential fourth book. Um, I'm trying in these books to treat that with some kind of, because usually that's just like, oh, they're just doing that because that's funny. The conceit is, okay, well, what if we take that at their word? What if they are somehow gods? Like, what does that mean? How much can they do? And we're kind of exploring, that's something that's, I think, going to be explored in this fourth book, because Zozimi is also related to Augustus, who is now
Mm.
dead and now
Hmm.
theoretically a god. Um, but he also tried to kill her as a baby. She was not wanted. Um, but if he can come back and help her with this, they have to hash out their differences too. But again, some magical hijinks are going to have to happen to bring him back from the dead, so to speak, which happens also a lot of these books. There's a lot of people don't stay dead the way they're supposed
No,
to. But that's kind of the vibe of those books where I the time period being further away personally gives me more license to be a little more fast and loose with facts, and like actual events happen as they do, how they go down is where we get to play a little more. So like that's kind
absolutely.
of where we're going in the fourth book, if I can get it finished.
And anything that's going to also just like thematically be on that grand scale, but then also deal with daddy issues is just like
Yeah,
catnip. It's
and
going to be
honestly, it's
fantastic.
I always joke with people because I started this book writing about, granted the Ptolemies are not strictly Egyptian, but about Egyptians because I love Egyptology and Egypt history. If you told me by the fourth one of these that we'd be so focused on Rome, I would have been like, what? But I think was and ultimately going to happen is also this book will complete perhaps the world's least deserved character rehabilitation for Augustus, who I did not start out these books being a fan of, but he and I are
He's
stuck with
grown
each
on
other.
you.
Yes, apparently he and I are stuck with each other, and I'm going to try to help him out with this. So we're going to try to write some of his wrongs from beyond the grave and see if what we can hash out.
There you go. Well, that all sounds, I mean, like, please take your time with it. Like, don't burn out because
Yeah, no.
your books are always such a joy to read that like it's worth waiting years if it's years before the next one. But well, Sarah, thank you so much. Oh, and I
Oh, and
think
before,
people can
yeah,
find you at sarahholtz.com.
yeah, that's my blog. It's just a WordPress blog. Honestly, that's probably the best way to connect with me because that's the thing I update the most. I do talk about what I'm writing, but honestly, a lot of it is just what weird stuff am I reading, what I'm doing, taking my day trips to the museum, like, so it's a little bit of everything. If you don't want to necessarily hear about the books, but you want to hear about the 10 weirdest Egyptian gods I could find, this is the blog for you.
This is the
um,
blog for you.
I am on Twitter at uh, Sarah L. Holtz. I'm mostly a lurker on Twitter, I will confess. I spend a lot of time there just watching book Twitter drama, but I am there if you want to find me. I do occasionally post, admittedly, mostly about my terrible hockey team. I'm still a Buffalo Sabres fan. Pray for me. uh, I am still on Facebook, but honestly, not very often. I won't turn people away though if you manage to dig me up somehow on there.
Yeah.
People tell me I should be on Instagram. I'm an older millennial, so I haven't gotten there yet, but maybe this year will be the year. So if that is, well, look on the other pages and I'll let you know if that
Yeah.
happens.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, the way you sound about Instagram is how I feel about TikTok as a middle of
Well,
the road
tick yeah,
millennial. I'm like, must I?
Yeah,
Must I be on
TikTok
there?
is even worse. Let's see if we can get on this Instagram and
Yeah,
then we'll
Instagram
tag
is, yeah.
we'll
Meanwhile,
tag
Twitter's like,
text.
speaking of Roman history, like the fall of Rome, just like people are
Oh
running by
gosh.
on
Yeah,
fire. Just
everybody I follow on Twitter is mostly book people or honestly classical people because like sometimes they
Mhm.
clue me into some good research and stuff.
Yeah,
But yeah, the drama there is just never ending.
unparalleled. Unparalleled. Well, Sarah, thank you so much for this conversation. Everyone, I don't have the date yet, but in February 2024, my guest is going to be Michelle Lizette Flores, who is a Cuban American author of such poetry chapbooks as Cuentos from the Swamp, Memoria, and she has a forthcoming poetry collection called Invasive Species. And we'll be reading and discussing Lauren Groff's semi-recent book, Florida, with her. So that should be a lot of fun. And yeah, thank you guys for listening and take care till next time.